Well, welcome. Thank you so much for tuning in. Today, I was going to host a webinar, but I had a few people reaching out to me saying, I can't make it at that time. I have a few questions, which I have here with me. Would you please address these questions? So I thought, what I'm going to do is record a session and pop it onto Facebook and other social media platforms. And that way it's a win-win for all. I will still make myself available for the webinar for additional Q&A, and that is here today, May 16th at 6:30 p.m. Mountain Standard Time. My name is Karie Castle. I am a registered dietitian. I happen to be a life coach. I have a background in alternative medicine as well, so there's a sort of wellness, full spectrum well-being that I like to address. And recently, I was very privileged to do a TED Talk here in Grand Prairie. And the topic that I delivered was a prescription for the greater side of emotional eating. And that got a few heads turning and queries and attention because the topic is sort of a spin on words, of course. Part of it is to remind us that we're breathing 24/7, we're always thinking, and we're always experiencing an emotion. Always. And so therefore, if I'm consuming my food with gratitude, joy, celebration, this is also an emotion. And I like to kind of create pivots and changes in perceptions that are on the positive way of approaching our food, because I think if you've been around for a little while, you've probably seen, like I have, almost every kind of diet imaginable, witnessing what we call the macronutrients, carbohydrates, proteins, and fats, duking it out for the spotlight. Each decade, it seems, there's a new trend. And so in the 80s, when I began my studies, it was carbohydrates. And then in the 90s, it was all about fat. And then came, where's the beef? And it became protein's turn. As of late, you may have been hearing about plant-based eating. Well, that's carbohydrates in disguise, making a comeback. And I think that's wonderful. But I do believe they all belong on our plate, that they all become a flexitarian way of eating, sharing a plate, because in these macronutrients are the micronutrients, our vitamins, minerals, antioxidants, fiber. When you take out a macronutrient, one of these big giants, you're literally taking out micronutrients. And that's where the rubber meets the road when it comes to our healing, our immune health, when it comes to how we digest our food. And further to that, I like to say maybe small hinges really could move big doors. And you've probably heard that saying before, but the point being, there's some aspects that we're not really talking enough about. We do talk about what to eat. We've heard about this now over the last few decades, as I mentioned. But what about how? Have we really focused on the how, emotionally or otherwise, while we're eating? And I am really drawing our attention to an aspect which is within our own DNA, where we tend to default, which is our fight flight response. I'm so glad we have it. It really does help save us when we're driving in traffic and veering out of harm's way. It has been what allowed us to be here in the first place. We would otherwise have been eaten. We would not have figured out how to eat. It's a very useful system that we can draw upon. However, it's become our default, and it has been chronically used. And hormones like cortisol are elevated when we're in the fight flight response. It is not at all superior for digestion. In fact, our digestion slows down under the fight flight response. And we, if you've ever done any running, for instance, it is not a time for eating solid foods. And so we are seeing a lot of digestive disorders. We're seeing a lot of heart health issues. In fact, heart disease is one of the number one reasons for death on our planet. So these surges in cortisol, for instance, are part of that correlation. Our heart will beat faster in an effort to prepare for the fight or the flight. But we do have another system. When we breathe in, for instance, through the nose, and then out through the mouth as though we're blowing through a straw, we're beginning to activate another system. We call it the rest, digest, create system. The word digest is in there. It is superior for our digestion. Hormones like serotonin are there to help us digest our food, absorb our nutrients, help us feel fuller faster, help us feel more fulfilled maybe so that we're not even reaching for food for all of what we're craving. There are other reasons we are hungry and craving. And in fact, when you work with me, I take you through a craving checklist to find out what might be behind the scenes. You might be low on nutrients. But I want to also draw our attention to what might ignite the fight flight response and ends up creating what feels like hormonal imbalance. And I have many, many clients that say, in fact, it's one of the questions I have written here, Karie, my hormones, I think, are out of balance. And maybe that's why I'm having some struggles with my health, be it weight issues or otherwise. And I do want to say, yes, that is a possibility, but we are the conductors with the switch in our mind by how we breathe, because the brain is trained to read how you breathe, to switch on and off the fight flight response or the rest digest create response. You cannot be on both at the same time. I like to use the example of AM and FM on your radio. You're only going to be able to go from AM or FM. You cannot be on both at the same time. And so switching over to FM, if you will, being our rest, digest, create system, we literally can calibrate our nervous system by how we breathe and balance some of our own hormones. Your cortisol might be elevated. You may be out of balance. But starting with foundational tools like how you breathe before you eat may be one of those small hinges that can move big doors. Second to that, what else might trigger your fight flight response? Is it from skipping meals and having caffeine? I'm not against caffeine. I love my cappuccinos in the morning, but caffeine does last in our system for roughly 5 to 7 hours. So therefore, having a cutoff time might be important for your hormones, because having superior sleep or proper sleep hygiene is also part of how we balance our hormones. We do produce more melatonin and serotonin, for instance, with proper sleep. This is where the rest, digest, and repair are also engaged. So we can at least begin with balancing our own hormones. The other thing that might engage the fight flight response could be when we are skipping meals, going for too long without eating, because low blood sugars can be sort of a surge occurrence that can create some anxiety, can create heart racing, palpitations, headaches, shakiness. This is really the fight flight response. So I work with people to do an experiment on when to eat, what space of time between their meals is appropriate for them according to their lifestyle, how they're digesting their foods, if they need snacks or not, because we don't really want this fight flight response engaged in inappropriate times where it's not necessary. We're not running from mammoths like we used to. So we can become the conductors of balancing our own hormones, even with proper meal spacing. Which brings me to one of the questions that I have here. What about fasting? Hey, there's cultures that believe in fasting, and I believe done well, done with our rest, digest, create system ignited is a great concept. There's nothing wrong with that for certain lengths of time. But there are many of us who experience lower blood sugars, as mentioned before, through going through a fasting period for too long. So that is an experiment that I do with individuals to find out what is their best window of time for eating and not eating. It is not the same for everyone. It is pretty typical that you may have heard dietitians say, try not eating past 8 o'clock p.m. And then by the time that you do eat your breakfast, breaking the fast, then it could have been a good 10 to 12 hour window right there, naturally, organically, as has been suggested for years. However, we have various shift workers, lifestyles, activity happening in the evenings. So one brush stroke for everyone is that's not a guaranteed message. In fact, if you experience restless legs, you find yourself waking up at 3 o'clock in the morning and you can't fall back to sleep. It is possible that you've run another cortisol cycle or a rise in you in the sense that your body's looking for food. So then we do an experiment to find that out as well. Nonetheless, just know that your own macronutrient profile, carbohydrates, proteins, and fats, and calories are unique to you. It is something that I explore with you. That leads us to the micronutrients. It leads us to the spacing of our meals and how we eat, what you eat and how you eat. Very important, not just to look at the what. I hope that this has provided a few tips. We've talked about macronutrients, hormones, and a little bit about on caffeine. Please reach out with your questions at nutritionbykarie@gmail.com. Karie spelled Karie. I'll be popping that into these links. Anything, the Domino Diet, which is a book that I've written and you have access to through Amazon and so forth. But that's another way to find me. kariecastle.com is my website. I welcome texts to 780-814-2983 for questions. My point being, I am happy to pop on and answer more questions. Check your benefits too, by the way, for potential free coverage to work with me. And I'm hosting more and more webinars to come, usually Thursday evening. So stay tuned for that. And I hope to see you having your healthiest, best full spectrum well-being.